first of all, I want to say thank you to both Dr. Minchin and Ken for opportunity to share your information with us this morning. So that's all. Go ahead.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity. We're going to be talking about what CMGC is and throw in some case studies. And I'm real pleased to have Ken Atkins with me this morning. Ken has a lot of experience with CMGC and works for the Federal Highway Administration. Next slide. We have no dog in the fight. I think next slide. This is fine. We're pretty, I think, unbiased people. DBIA obviously is pushing for design build or progressive design build. Attorneys want design bid build. I was in a meeting on a technical working group doing some bundling research for the Federal Highway Administration, and had an attorney from Pennsylvania, I believe it was, just say that admit that he had made an impassioned plea for design bid build, and he admitted upon cross-examination that the reason he liked it was because there was more litigation. More work for him and with design bid build. So attorneys like design bid build. Next slide. We're a pretty unbiased pair. I'm a university professor that has worked for an FTBA contractor in my career, and also the Florida Department of Transportation. Ken is an FHWA engineer that's worked for the Army in a Florida county, among other things. He's worked for a couple of other cities. Professionally, I don't care what you use. As a Florida taxpayer, however, I do care that CMGC is not even in the toolbox. I think that we're really missing out on an excellent opportunity if we would put CMGC in the toolbox. It would be a good thing.
Well, and I'm not quite as unbiased as Dr. Minchin, so.
Well, some guy named Prasad said that change is inevitable. I don't know if any of you guys heard about that. Next slide. A well-known Army general put it, a little less politically correct, Ken?
Yeah, I was fortunate. I just, by the grace of God, got through Command and General Staff College, and there's an 80% attrition rate. So the number one reason that majors don't make colonel in the Army is this course. So thankfully, I made it through. I was one of the 20% by the grace of God. But they teach us this as leaders, and it's one of the premier colleges in the Army as far as how to command theater operations. And what they teach us as leaders, we have to be learners. And if we're not learners, what happens is we become irrelevant. And once we become irrelevant, we become replaced. So this is a really good reminder that we have to stay technically and tactically proficient, and we have to always be up on the latest trends. And that was the point behind this, was to make sure that we know what tools are in our toolbox. And in Army, what we have to do is we employ weapon systems on the battlefield. And as leaders, we have to know what those different weapon systems are capable of, because that's what makes us win battles. And if one's sitting there like a paperweight, it's not going to do us any good. And so what we're doing today is talking about a very powerful tool that we have as owners that can actually make you win on the battlefield. And I did want to thank Anant and Joe, because actually the reason I'm with Federal Highway, like Dr. Minchin said, is about 10 years ago, Greg Hostetler and I felt led by God to come out and tell our story. We had taken over an Osceola program that Dr. Minchin said, and it was arguably the worst program in the Southeast. And by the grace of God, we had turned it into what Public Works Magazine said it was the most successful and innovative program in the nation. And we felt so led to go out and tell our story about what CMGC can do. And if it can take a program like ours and take people who knew almost nothing about CMGC like us and turn it into one of the most successful programs in the nation, that's why we're here today. And that's actually why I'm with Federal Highway. Is Greg Hostetler and I went out and started telling our story. And by the grace of God, we met Dr. Minchin. And we also met Federal Highway Administration, and they picked up our story and gave us the opportunity to tell it nationally. So we really believe in this method. And that's why I jokingly said to Dr. Minchin, I'm not quite as unbiased, because this has changed my career. It's changed my personal life, and it's changed my professional life. And I truly believe that this is something that we really need to look at, because it can change the way we do business. So I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Minchin.
Okay, next slide. That's you, Ken.
Yeah, this is one that my grandfather always told. My grandfather actually invented frozen concentrated orange juice, and he's in the Citrus Hall of Fame in Florida and went to University of Florida. And that's one reason I'm so thankful to get to work with UF. And he taught me about Edward Deming. And for those of us who don't know, Deming is the one that went over to Japan after World War II. Eisenhower sent him after the 2 atomic bombs, and Eisenhower asked him to go over and help them rebuild their manufacturing industry. And as you know, they had pretty much been wiped off the map, and they had a strange goal. And the goal was to become the #1 auto manufacturer in the world. So Deming went over there and helped him and helped the Japanese. And in less than 10 years, guess what? They became the #1 auto manufacturer in the world. And my grandfather always quoted Deming because they were friends. And he said, a bad system will kill a good man every time. So we know the systemic issues with low bid. We know what it brings us, and we know what it doesn't bring us. And what we're talking about is a completely different system. Because when you change the system, the problems drop out. And that's what we did with Osceola, was we changed the system. And that's what we teach across the country, is if you use a different system, a lot of systemic problems that we have with low bid will no longer be there. And another thing my dad taught me, he was a full bird in the Army. And he always said, son, everything rises or falls based on leadership or lack thereof. I was doing a job one time out on building a bridge for M1 tanks. And I called him on a field phone, and he was a dentist in the Army, in a hotel, and I'm in the dirt and the wet and the rain. And I was complaining because the guys wouldn't do what I wanted to do. And he said, let me ask you a question, son. He said, if the right leader came out there, could that leader actually motivate the guys to do what you want them to do? And I said, well, absolutely they could. And I was looking for consolation with him. And he said, well, then son, be that leader. So what this really says is that we're responsible for 85% of all the problems, and maybe even more. So if you choose a different system, we can drop out a lot of the other problems. And whereas we blame people and employees, it's really the system that we use. So with that, Dr. Minchin, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, we're going to be talking about a situation that second quote, management actions are responsible for 85% of all problems. We're going to look at a sad example of that here in the next slide. Next slide. I'm convinced that Florida would be well along to being the leader that it once was with CMGC if it weren't for the Miami Intermodal Center project. Florida was one of only 3 states that were using CMGC when I got interested in doing the research in this field, and started on my own dime going down to Miami 3 times a year, once every 4 months, and just keeping up with this project. And it was fascinating to watch, but sadly, it was kind of like watching a car wreck in slow motion. And the fact that it went so poorly, I believe, is a reason that Florida slammed on the brakes on CMGC and hasn't done anything since, other than a couple of bascule bridges and some vertical construction using this system. And if you look at this project and do a kind of a post-mortem on it, which is what I tried to do this weekend, again, looking back through my notes, we find some interesting things. And the Miami Intermodal Center, for those of you that don't know, was the first CM at risk transportation project ever funded by FHWA. It was the largest construction project in the history of the state of Florida at the time. And it was the largest CM at risk transportation project in U.S. history. And we're going to talk about the difference between CM at risk and CMGC. There is a difference. At this time, there was no CMGC in transportation construction, so don't get confused. But they're close enough together. They're close enough together to be totally relevant here. This was a $2.4 billion project, a mega project, and 1.35 billion of it was in phase one, which is where all the problems happened, and what we're going to be talking about today. So next slide. The first 4 GMPs actually of the phase one were where the problems originated. And I got an education quickly from Earth Tech, who was the owner's rep, the project manager, program manager, or whatever, that the DOT had procured. And Earth Tech had done a lot of CMGC, CM at risk work at the time. And I made the mistake of calling the first $17.6 million contract a phase. I said, this is phase one. And they corrected me very quickly. No, phase one is 8 GMPs. And so they use the term GMP to mean 2 things. One is the actual guaranteed maximum price of the contract that they agree on, the parties agree to. But the other is they actually call what I would call, let's say, a subphase. They call that a GMP. So GMP 1 was these foundations and underground utilities. And you can look here at these values here of these GMPs, and you can note quickly that the first 3 are kind of small compared to the 4th one, and of course they get bigger after that. And we'll get back to that. The next slide. I identified 12 problems with this project, and I'm going to go through each one of them and very quickly, given the time. But we have 12 problems. Next slide. The first one was a decision, and it was the decision for an inexperienced owner, and I do mean the inexperienced with CMGC, an inexperienced owner taking on the largest project in history. So instead of doing the pilot program like we did in the 1990s that I was a part of when I worked with DOT, that we did for design build, instead of having a pilot program to get our feet wet and learn what we were doing, we jumped in and did the biggest project in history for our first project. And I mean, what could go wrong, right? So we made that big mistake and got off on the wrong foot there. Problem number 2 was GMPs number 1, 2, and 3 were small, as you saw. I pointed those out. The reason that was a problem was that the DOT had made a big deal out of this project, which it was. It is a huge deal, was a huge deal, and was going to bring an incredible amount of boost to the economy in South Florida. Just building the thing, plus all the benefits of having it once it's completed. But they made a big deal out of it in the press and everything. And then you come out and your first GMP, your first contract you're going to sign is 17.6 million, which, you know, that's a lot of money to me personally. But you know, even in 20 years ago, $17.6 million wasn't a big highway contract. So it was kind of like much ado about nothing. Then you follow it up with another small contract in GMP2, and people just lost interest. The design industry in Florida, South Florida, lost interest. The contracting industry in South Florida lost interest. But worst of all, the county, where you had to get a lot of your permits, they didn't take the project seriously. and that was a big problem. So that was another problem. Problem number 3 was we skipped the step of hiring a lead design professional, a designer. We skipped that step and went and hired a sub designer because the work in GMP1 was all foundations. We just went out and hired a geotech, and the geotech started designing. And that was probably a little bit of a mistake too, because you're supposed to, hopefully you would have a CM involved to help with the design. That's the way it's supposed to work. So off went the geotech, and they meant to get they meant to bring the GMP, I mean the CM on quickly, and but they didn't, had different delays and things, which I just don't have time to go into. I'd love to go into the details, but I don't have time. So as a result then of the previous decisions, problem number 4 was that Turner couldn't meet FDOT's budgeted price for GMP number 1. And that's a problem because Turner, as the CM, was using actual prices to set all their to set up their costs. Their estimate was all using actual prices, and they couldn't meet the DOT's budget. There was no wiggle room since they were using actual subcontractor prices. And it's different than a design bid build job, because a design bid build job, you take different quotes and you massage them, take what you need, do what you need to do to come up with your bid. But with this, it's not that way. The prices are public, and you got no wiggle room there.
Well, and I would say, Dr. Mention, if I can cut in, that's one of the advantages of CMGC is you are getting actual costs. You're
That's
not
right.
getting estimates based on bid averages. When they give you their estimates, they're based on real costs, your material costs, your invoices. And so that's why it's a huge advantage over estimating based on what your bid opening is.
Absolutely. If it's done correctly, this is an advantage, not a disadvantage. But in this case, they were not doing it correctly. The design, you understand, got way ahead of the construction. So by the time Turner went to come up with their GMP, they were boxed in because the design was finished. They had no part in it, and so that was the problem. Next slide. The fifth problem was force majeure. It was not anybody's fault that had anything to do with the project. I wouldn't call it an act of God, but we had a 9/11. They had the 9/11 happen, the World Trade Center bombings, and it destroyed the financial model for the project, because the Miami International Airport was a partner in this project, and suddenly they had no income. So it screwed up the financial model. It's also stopped the CM and design professional selection process, which is what, kind of got, I went back and forth about whether one should be problem 4 and 5 and the other one should be 5 and 4, but this worked together. 9/11 happened in there, and that's why the design got finished. And then we look at problem number 6. The geotechnical engineer just kept designing, and so by the time you went to get your CM and get a GMP settled on and agreed to, you had a mess, because 9/11 had happened. The geotech had continued to design. the design was finished, and the contractor, the CM, had no input to the design, and they had no wiggle room, so they just couldn't meet the cost. And so they never, the GT, and it kept on through GMPs 1, 2, 3, and 4. They just kept, nobody stopped those designers from designing. They just kept designing and got way ahead of the construction process. So you kept
you mentioned something Dr. mentioned is that the key to CMGC is, like he mentioned, is designing as you're getting real-time pricing.
Right.
So you don't want to get ahead of it. You want the CM to price it and say, are we within budget and can we afford what we're designing?
Exactly.
So when you proceed forward with your design, you don't know that you can afford what you're designing, and that's the issue.
Yep, that's right. And then you get to where there's no way out. There's no wiggle room there. But then it's about the same time you had some human error. Problem number 7. FDOT was shocked to find out that instead of 2 years for the application for the needed building permit had only a 1-year shelf life. They read it as 2 one-year extensions. It was 2 extensions totaling 1 year. So that put them in a box. Next slide. And so also about the same time, the county, as they're coming along with their new building code, and FDOT was then faced with a tough decision to start, whether to start construction immediately or restart the permit process under the new code. And the decision was made to commence construction, which was a mistake. It would have cost them $200,000 to redesign under the new code. They went ahead and we've documented that the cost that they faced, not to mention the heartache of going ahead and starting the design. It would have cost them 10 times the $200,000. It ended up costing them 10 times the $200,000 it would have cost them to do the design by going ahead and starting the construction. Number 9 problem was that FDOT held firm on their budget, even though Turner showed them the actual cost and showed them that they are showing them real costs here, like Ken said. But the DOT wouldn't budge. And Turner, you told me that they went ahead and took basically GMP 1. They agreed to it because they had $1.35 billion ahead of them. They didn't want to blow it on the 17.5 million. So they went ahead and took GMP number 1 at cost to keep things moving.
Well, and Dr. Mitchell, you said something that Kat mentioned is that's the reason we have an independent cost estimator. It's a former contractor or someone with bidding experience. And those are the numbers that we actually should use in comparing Turner's field costs, so that we know that, because the ICEs do cost from a bottom-up estimate. They do based on production rates. They don't do based on averages, which is what engineers do, bid averages and things like that. So the fundamental error is what the ICE does is they bring you real costs. You have 2 contractors estimating the same job, and that's what you should compare to, because that's the litmus test, not the engineer's estimate, because the engineer estimate in CMGC actually becomes more of nothing more than just a courtesy, and it really doesn't apply because it's not estimated the same way, and it's not based on real cost.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Then problem number 10 was they had not, the people that were running it, whether it's Earth Tech or the DOT or whoever, had done no training or education to the local industry or county officials. This was a new thing. This CM at risk CMGC thing, nobody had ever done it, but they didn't educate anybody. As a matter of fact, they didn't educate themselves too well. And the county had no idea how incredibly important it was to speed permitting along. For instance, again, the small size, the county did not take it seriously. There's no contractor on board. This can't be a real project. We don't have a contractor on board. Screwing around and not getting the CM on board, not getting your lead designer on board till way down the line, and not educating industry, educating your subcontractors. Now, this is how this works. This is different than design, bid, build, hard dollar, low bid. This is different. This is a team that we're going to be part of here, and this is the way we work things. And it's a different culture, and the DOT did not either understand the culture, which I think was a lot of it, but the DOT also did not do any education or training to anybody that they're going to be working with about the need for the culture.
Well, and you mentioned that, Dr. Mention. That's why we, with Federal Highway, what we do is we go around nationally, and we've trained probably 50 plus DOTs and LPAs, and we come in and work with the DOT, and because it's one thing that Dr. Mention says in his study, it's a cultural change, and it is a completely different system. So if you run it like a low bid or you run it like design build, what happens is you bastardize the system and you turn it into just a modified version of low bid, so then you get low bid results, or you turn it into design build, so then you bastardize CMVC and you get design build results. So what we do is we make sure that before an agency starts this, is we offer a 2-day training, and we come out and give a formal training session on the best practices across the nation, because we can't tell you how to do it correctly, but we can certainly tell you how to screw it up. So if you just don't do the things that we know not to do, you'll be extremely successful. Of course, you'll be successful anyway, but we can take you from good to great or great to outstanding.
Yeah, well, that leads right into problem number 11, which was they did treat Turner like a design bid build contractor, and the whole thing is that Turner, in this case, the CEM, the deal is the CEM, just like a design builder, takes on more risk than a design bid build contractor, but you're supposed to get paid for that. You're supposed to get paid for taking on that extra risk. And so when you start acting like a design bid build job, you basically put the contractor in a situation that happens when you use low bid design build, by the way, where the contractor loses the extra money they're supposed to be getting for taking on the extra risk, and they also have the extra risk. So people get upset about that. Then what happened here, though, was that Turner was they were unhappy, and so anytime anything came up on the job that they didn't like, they would go to the contractor, go to the owner, like a design a bid build contractor would, and threaten to file a claim. And then the DOT made the mistake of treating them like a design bid build contractor and negotiating with them on these things, and it just at this point started really unraveling.
Well, and you mentioned something, Dr. Mention, is one thing that we stress in the training is we don't call them contractors. We recommend calling them construction managers, because they're not a low bid contractor. They're a professional construction management firm that comes in to help you through the design phase and help us succeed, and to tell us if they, because they always say if you're a contractor, I've had them come up numerous times when I was in the field, and they say, Ken, if you had just brought me in during design, I could have helped you so much. If you had just brought me in during this time, and this is what this method does, is it brings the contractor who knows how to build it. We're guessing when we design it, and they actually know what they're doing, and they can tell us the smartest, best way to do this. But that's why we treat them as a construction manager, because they're not a low bid contractor. You're not getting low bid costs. You're getting the actual cost of the work, versus low bid, you're getting a price, which is never the final price that we pay, right? The price that you're getting is the lowest price, but it's not the final price. We always say that the average job across America finishes 30% late and over budget, and that's nationwide. So in low bid, we are getting the lowest price, but we're not getting the lowest cost. So there is a big distinction. So our staff personally, we wouldn't allow them to use the term contractor. They had to call them by construction manager.
Anyway, I worked with DOT for 13 years, and I know that the DOT likes to be in control, and you got to give up a little bit of the control with this. But that's where you get your innovation, and that's where you get some wonderful things happening. So anyway, next slide. Problem number 12 was the coup de grace, the last one. This was their biggest mistake. and it led to a change in the way they did things. And the GMPs 5 through 8 went great, and you ended up with a fine product. But the decision was that in these first 3 GMPs, it was 2 instant replays of GMP 1. Basically, Turner's taking them at cost. They're thinking things are going to get better, but the design keeps going, and it keeps staying ahead of construction. So you got the same problem over and over again. And finally, on GMP 4, it's more money. It's just more money. It's 160 million, 162 million, whatever it was, and Turner just can't eat it, so they just can't get together. So there's an impasse. They couldn't agree. FDOT relet GMP number 4, as Kat said, that you can do with the progressive design build. They exercised that option and relet it as a low sum design bid build project. Turner was allowed to bid on it because Turner had nothing to do with the design, so you don't have the problem you have with progressive design bid build there. But Turner was allowed to rebid as one of the 3 bidders that bid on the project, and they bid $370 million, and they were the low bidder. Remember, the engineer's estimate was 160. So it was exactly twice their original offer that was rejected, and they were the low bidder. Well, what happened? Well, you might remember the worldwide steel shortage. China had bought all the steel in the world. There was a worldwide steel shortage. The price of steel shot through the roof. And this happened between the time that the DOT finally rejected Turner's last offer of 185 million and the year later that it took to relet it as a design bid build job, or the several months. And it did take a year before they realized then, gosh, we got to reopen negotiation with Turner for the CM at risk. So Turner knocked 10% off and settled for 333 million, which was 148 million over the price that the DOT had rejected earlier. Okay, new slide. Ken?
Okay. So this one is like I told you, my grandfather helped me. You know, we've had a lot of case studies, and Dr. mentioned Greg Hostert and I were fortunate enough to work on his research team for 2 years, and we had about 5 years worth of case studies, and that's great. But it's hard to go to your leadership and sell case studies, right? Because that's just based on our experience. Well, now by the grace of God, literally we have data. So when we started 10 years ago, we had no data. We just had case studies, which was very tough to sell to your leadership. Now, based on Dr. Molinar's research and from University of Colorado Boulevard, and based on Dr. Minchin's research from University of Florida, we have data, which is huge. So Deming always said, in God we trust, all others bring data. So next slide.
This is just a brag sheet for Ken. When he was doing all this work for CMGC, he caught people's attention. Engineering News Record named him one of the top 25 newsmakers of 2009. They call it the miracle of Osceola, the Osceola County miracle for what he did. And we'd love to spend time telling you all about that, but we just don't have time. But he got a lot of good publicity about that. And Ken is a guru when it comes to CMGC. Next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Minchin. You know, teaching in front of Dr. Minchin, I always say, to quote him, is like talking about the flood in front of Noah. So he's very, very gracious, but he's the one that actually brought us in. And in reality, it was a team's effort. But it shows you the power of a team, and with this method, and this is the only method where you can build your own team. And I have to say, like Greg Hostert was deputy director, Jason Bolonois was the head of construction. So it took a team, and we even used Turner, which was one of our best CMs. So it really does show the power of a team. But this is NCHRP 787, and this is the one I was fortunate, and Greg and I worked on under Dr. Minchin. But it was the first guidebook for CMGC, and not only CMGC, but design build. So we studied every program across the country that would allow us to interview them, and came up with this guidebook. And it's really a best practices on how to go through the pre-construction phase for CMGC and design build. So next slide. And I always like to give credit where it's due. Is Dr. Molinar had, I called him and he graciously let him use this research. And a lot of what we're showing, like I said, if it's our opinion, we'll tell you, but if it's based on research, we'll also tell you that. And this is the quantification of costs, benefits, and risk with ACMs or alternative contracting methods. And we consider Dr. Molinar one of the best researchers in the nation, in the top 3. And what he said basically is CMGC is 50% faster than low bid. So that's a summary of their study. But this is a great guidebook, and it actually has the data that we're going to show you next. So next slide. And the newest thing that we have out that was federal highway funded as well, as the previous one was partially federal highway funded. Now this is NCHRP, but we never had a guidebook for the administration. And a lot of what Dr. Mention says is you can basically throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is this method is a leadership method, and it's only as good. Like we said, 85% of all problems are either leadership or lack thereof. So this method, its biggest strength is it's a leadership-led method. Its biggest weakness is it's a leadership-led method. So if we don't lead it correctly, it will go to hell in a handbasket, and that's what we see across the country. But if you lead it correctly, it's the most powerful, we believe, the most powerful method that there is, and it's the highest performing method. But now, thankfully, based on NCHRP and Dr. Molinar, we have a guidebook on how to properly administer these projects, which we never had before. So I wanted to notice that. And if you notice the bullet number 2, it says, may show the most promise for accelerating delivery times. We used to hear that if you wanted speed, design build was the way to go. Well, that's not the case anymore. If you want speed now, you can either use design build or CMGC because they're equally as fast. So next slide. This is a slide by Dr. Molinar, and what it says is it's really critical to look at is it's actually construction cost growth. So if you look at CMGC, you'll notice that the other methods are 4 times the cost growth, which is significant. Remember, we talked about knowing your weapon systems as a leader. We have to understand what this thing is capable of doing. And what it's capable of doing is having the other methods have 4 times the cost growth. So we actually call this a zero change order method. And really, you show 0.9%, but actually we got, in my opinion, the one thing CMGC is really good at is building more scope for the job. So unfortunately, when we built more scope, we got that dollar amount charged against us. So I would say that your cost growth is even less than the 0.9%. It's closer to 0 because we build the most work with this method. But unfortunately, when they calculated that, when we added extra work based on saving money, they calculated those savings against us. So you can see the tremendous difference. And like Deming said, a bad system will beat a good man every time. So if you change the system, the problems will drop out, which is what you see on this graph. So next slide. Now, we talked about one of the things that Dr. Mention came out, you always have a PhD statement in one of these. And what he said is if you want a need for speed, you can, they used to tell you, if you want speed, do not use CMGC. That is absolutely could not be further from the truth. And the other thing that CMGC does, it can accomplish speed, but it actually gives you the most scope for your job. So not only is it the fastest or one of the fastest methods out there, because we do not have a handoff between the original designer and the design package. There is no handoff. And usually what we say is when you hand off a design build, you can lose up to 30% efficiency. So the reason we can be faster is we stick with the original designer and we never change. So you never have a handoff, and then you save that handoff the loss of efficiency. So next slide. And this is, you had it there, and I think we missed it there for a second.
Yeah.
Go forward one more. There we go. Okay, this is my favorite slide, and I could literally, Greg would say, I could spend an hour on this slide because this is based on the data that Dr. Molinar came out with. So forget mean costs. That's just the average price of the job. That's just a sample size. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But if you look at mean project duration, that's your design, that's your construction, that's your permitting. So if you try to add them across, they're not going to add because there's variables in there, right? So I know us engineers like to add across, and it's not going to add together. But what you look is that's your total project duration. The average is 1726 across the country. So that's design and construction and permitting. And if you look in the middle, CMGC is at 662. And that's what we're talking, and that's across the country. That's every program across the nation studying. These are major projects. We're not talking about $10, $15 million projects. We're talking about 50 to 100 million to $1 billion programs. And another thing, if you look at design, if the average is 904, we're at 281. So why are we so fast? We're so fast, and there's many, many reasons, but one reason is if at all possible, we bring the CM in at the same time as the designer, and we bring the ICE in at the same time, and we design very efficiently. So we're not designing bid sets. So the average time in America between 90% plans and breaking ground using low bid is 1 year. So we don't have to have bid sets in this method because we're not bidding the job, we're getting pricing as we go. So off the bat, we automatically save 1 year. And then if you look to the right, which is construction days, you'll notice the average is 699. We're at 349 days. So how can we be half to a third of what the other methods are? The reason is because we build our own team. We have the best in the nation, the best in the industry, and we start as close to time zero as, and all that you need to start this is a budget and a vision and some basic goals and objectives. That's all we need. We don't need any design plans. We don't have to be at 30%. Because we say by 30%, 80% of your cost decisions are made. So what we want to do is, like Dr. Minchin said, we want to come in closer to time zero. So next slide. Okay, and advance one more. Thank you. Okay, so this is the percent of projects with major delays. Okay, so if you look at CMDC, it's half of design build and it's half of low bid. And really it's less because, like we said, in our opinion, based on University of Florida's research, is as we go, because CMDC, you get more scope for your money. It provides the best value to the owner of any method that we have. Is as we were adding scope, we obviously have to add time. So as we save money and we're able to build more scope, they counted that time against us. So I would say that it's actually less than what it shows on here, but even so, you're looking at half of the delays using CMGC versus other methods. Next slide.
Well, this is an interesting slide. I think, Ken, you talked about how two research projects that happened 10 years apart ended up with pretty much the same graph. And we're running short on time, so it just shows the amount of total risk goes down if you do it if you do it right. Ken, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would add, 10 years ago when we did our research with Dr. Minchin, we created this graph, and this was based on case studies. And we believe that CMDC actually reduced the risk more than any other method. The reason it reduces the risk more than any other method is in low bid, obviously the owner takes the risk and the majority of the risk because we prescribe exactly how we want it done in plans and specs. In design build, we push the risk over to the design build team because we say you have to build it for a price, traditionally low bid price, right? And you have to do it for a schedule. So we're pushing the risk over to the design builder, which costs us two things. It costs us time and money. Whereas CMDC, we're mitigating those risks as a team. We're not allocating them, we're not transferring them, we're trying to get rid of them. So it by far, the most powerful thing about CMDC second innovation is it does the best job actually getting rid of these risks. So 10 years ago, we drew this graph based on our case study. And literally by the miracle, by the grace of God, Molinar came out with the same graph based on data, which we were thrilled because I was afraid to look at the graph, right? I thought, oh my God, what's going to come out? Well, he came out with the exact same graph, which shows the data backed up everything that we thought in the case studies. So thanks, Dr. Minchin. Next slide.
Next slide. Would like to expose and eliminate some myths next. There's no middleman with CMGC. Next. There's no extra 10% markup with CMGC. Next. The myth came from some CM at risk projects 20 years ago that prevented the CM from self-performance. Next. CMGC was developed to do away with this and CMGC requires self-performance by the CM, so there is no middleman. This myth got started because some projects, now the Miami Intermodal Center wasn't this way back then. If the CM wanted to do some work or self-perform some work, they had to bid against their own subs, and if they had the low bid, then they could do the work. But that doesn't even exist anymore. We did away with CM at risk, and now we use CMGC for that reason. Next.
Hey, Dr. Minchin and Ken, we gotta hurry up, so we're getting close. So.
Understand. Look at the difference. Look at these comparison of these org charts, and you'll see that the design bid build and the CMGC are identical, except for there's a line between the designer and the contractor, that the CM, excuse me, that there is no contractual relationship there. It's just that they work together. Okay, so really, if you're used to design bid build, CMGC is closer to what you're used to than design build. Next. Love to go through this, don't have time. The two most important ones are the innovation and the reduction and allocation and reallocation of risk. Ken talked about that already. Constructability, I'm doing a research project on that right now. That's really important too. Love to talk to you about it, but don't have time. Next. Had the Mountain View Corridor next. Utah DOT job 15 miles. This is what Ken talked about the scope increasing, and they charge you with more time and more money in the statistics. But it was a 15-mile project. Ended up being a 17.5-mile project because they saved so much money by innovations and risk allocating and reallocating and reducing the risk that they were able to buy 2.5 miles more of real estate for right of way and pay the contractor to build 2.5 miles of construction.
Yeah, and I would say, Dr. Minchin, we're finding that across the country with the ones that we're piloting with Federal Highway. Just Caltrans, for example, Ray Tritt's the master of CMGC, one of the top in the country of the DOTs, and he's just off the bat a project we helped set up his team facilitated. The first quarter, they saved $91 million in innovations and risk reduction. So that kind of tells you. So this isn't atypical. This is actually typical. We're finding this across the country for LPAs, cities, counties, tribes, major DOTs, mega projects over 500 million, and also smaller projects. So go ahead, Dr. Minchin.
Next. This just shows the different ways that the risk was changed from one party to the other and how they save money. Don't have time to talk about it. Next. And when I asked Turner, the PM of Turner, why they were willing to take 10% less to do the job using CMGC than the hard dollar bid, he said, because we'd rather work as a part of a team than to be an enemy, unquote. And so what would be possible if the people around you refuse to let you fail? Last slide. People think of George Patton as a guy who went around screaming all the time and motivation, motivation, motivation. But he was a very, very good delegator, and he had a hard, fast rule: never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. And that was the key to his success.
And I would say, Dr. Minchin, that's the beauty of this method is we don't tell the team how to do anything. We just tell them what we want. We bring in leaders, and when you bring in leaders to a group, you grow it exponentially. When you bring in managers, you can only flatline and make it run efficiently. But this method is the only method that we can hand select our team and bring in leaders. And that's why our performance is so high, because the military teaches that if you bring in leaders, you grow your organization exponentially. And that's why we get the results on the graphs that we do.
Thank you. Sorry we ran over.
It's all good for me. How about you, Nath?
Yeah, a couple of questions. So Ken, Osceola County, who was the CM contractor?
Well, you asked a good question. We actually in Nath had 7 different CMs on that job. So we released 18 different projects simultaneously, and we had 7 different CMs. One was Turner, obviously. One was One is Junior Davis. We had several different ones. So, and that shows you the power. We had never done CMGC, but we brought in professional construction management firms, and they actually helped teach us how to do CMGC. And that's the partnership, like Dr. Minchin said. The trust is so high in this method that allows you to do things even as an inexperienced owner. They actually mentored us and taught us how to do CMGC, if you can believe that. So.
And so in CM also, you're selecting the CM based on quals, right? Obviously, there's no price.
Well, you asked a good question. There's a couple ways you can do it, and it also depends on state statute. The way that we recommend, if you can, more advanced organizations and DOTs, they go qualification strictly, because this is the only method. Federal highway does not require you to do best value. Qualifications is fine, and that's what we encourage, because price does not mar your decision, because it's the only method that you can pick your actual team without involving price. So we recommend you stay away from price because it causes a lot of issues. And then you can pick the most qualified contractor, but there are states that require them to be picked on best value. And so what we recommend, if that's the case, that you put a small pricing component. And we have case studies on how to help different DOTs do that. If you do require a price component, then we try to keep it very small, and we try to score it very low so that it doesn't become a low bid system.
Okay. So, and then you talked about the risk being low, and the reason the risk being low is because you're working with the department or the owner's designer, and you're sort of, managing the risk, right? Or allocating the risk.
Well, you asked a good question. We don't like to really use the term allocating, because that means that we talk about that's a lazy team effort. We just push the risk over to the builder, which is design build. We push the risk over to the owner, which is low bid. In our case, what we try to do is, as a team, we try to get rid of the risk. So the first thing we do is work on we do a risk matrix, and we assign a champion and co-champion. And we do everything we can do. We brief that every week or every 2 weeks to get rid of that risk. And then at the very last effort, if we can't get rid of it, the last thing that we do is we'll allocate it to the responsible party we think can handle it best. But that's the last thing we do. Whereas in other methods, that's the first thing we do. And that's why we're able to drop it. What we also do is reverse engineering. Instead of designing a set of plans and asking the builder if it's constructible, we bring the builder in, preferably at time zero, and we say, how would you build this? What's the most efficient way? Because you know better than anybody. Nobody knows how to build something as well as a contractor. Then we design it that way. And that's why we're so much more efficient, is we're not guessing. Because when I brief a general, the first thing I have to brief him on is what my assumptions were, because that's what my risks are. That's where his or her risks are. But in this method, we're not making assumptions. We're asking the builder, you tell us how you would build it, and then we'll design it that way. And as long as the designer agrees, which most of the times they do, then we have the best product. And we don't have to worry about constructability, because the contractor already told us, the construction manager, this is the smartest way to build it. So it takes a tremendous amount of stress off the designer as well, because they're not at such risk of guessing how they might build it. So really good question. That's a really good one.
Ananth, I didn't have time to go through it, but on the Mountain View corridor, to answer your question, it was a perfect. Your question was a perfect lead-in for that. This project was built at the very point where all the utilities cross the Rocky Mountains from the east to the west, west to the east. And a lot of risk there, a lot of risk. And the prices were coming in really high from the CM. And so the Utah DOT just said, what would happen if we were to take the risk for the gas line? Well, the price came down. And so then they said, well, what would happen if we took the risk for the telecommunications? The price went down. What would happen if we took the risk for all of these utilities? The price came down so low that they were able to build 2.5 miles of extra road with the money they saved. So that's a flexibility that CMGC gives you that no other delivery system will give you.
Well, Nance, you bring up a fundamental point, which is the genius behind this method is that nobody knows risk like the contractor does, right? Because the contractor has to build the job. So they see risks like we just don't see. And they're able to tell us these are the risks that we see very early in the design, and we're able to try to get rid of them. That's the difference, is we don't just transfer it. we ask the builder, tell us what the majority of the risks are on this job, and then we as a team are going to try to get rid of them. And that's the difference in the pricing. Is in low bid, your risk is in the unit items, it's in mobilization, it's in all kinds of things. In this method, we don't do that. The price is the cost of the work is exactly the material costs or production rates. It is not the risk. The risk is put aside in a matrix, and then we work to try to get rid of that. And that's the difference. So you're not paying additional, you're actually paying less in risk, because we all identify what would this risk cost us. Is it a $10 million risk? And then we don't put it in the unit item, because if you put it in the unit item, every square yard of pavement that we're putting down, we're paying that risk whether we see it or not. Where in this case, we decide, so we don't have to pay that risk if we don't see it. And at the end, the team can, Kat mentioned, the team can use that money to build more scope. So if we don't see that risk, we take that additional risk money and we put it back into the work. So really,
well, I guess the thing that I struggle with, and I know we got to wrap it up, and we'll have a lot of conversations this afternoon on the projects, is that on a CMGC, when the designer is working for the owner and the contractor brings up a risk element, it seems to get resolved, like you said, appropriately, versus in a design build, when the design build firm makes a comment to the department, asks a question through the RFP process about utilities and risk, the owner doesn't seem to be interested in addressing that. So I think, what I'm struggling with is all those things that, not all the things, I'm not saying CMGC doesn't have its benefit and progressive design build doesn't have benefits, but there's some elements of those risk management strategies in CMGC could and should happen in a design build arena where it is not happening. You see what I'm saying? So, case in point, we've been talking Florida about utilities on design build, and DOT can fix that, right? They can address it, and they'll manage the risk, right? So, they've done a better job lately, but that's where I struggle with is that element of managing the risk, because ultimately an owner can manage that risk based through we kicked around the idea of having a risk register workshop on design builds. And maybe you can, instead of having an ATC meetings, the design build teams can have one-on-one risk register meetings, and the department and through its consultant can hear from the design build teams as some of the risk elements and what the cost implications are, and the owner can then decide where best to put the risk, right? So anyway, that's I think sort of some of the distinctions, but.
Well, let's go ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Mitchell.
I know we've only got 3 minutes, but I do a lot of DRB, so I talk to a lot of contractors, and I hear a lot about the fact that with this the low bid design build, they're under a lot of pressure. They're talking about that, they have too much risk, and that is true. It may have been before your time, or it might have been when you were the secretary. I don't remember, but I remember that the contractors at a time came to the DOT and wanted to get rid of this black box, as they called it, because they didn't understand how the design builders were being chosen, and they wanted to do away with the black box. So they wanted to go to this low bid design build system. And when we did that, we put a lot of risk on the contractors, and we're not giving them any money to make it worth their while to hold that risk. And we've risen a lot. We've driven up the tenseness, the tension because of that. And so I think if the contractors back then had demanded transparency instead of low bid, they would have been way ahead, because that's what the contractors did in North Carolina. They demanded transparency, and North Carolina has a very transparent design build system.
My point is the design build, Florida's design build is not a low bid. It is the best value. Now, overwhelmingly price drives it, but it is not low bid. There is a technical score, and they're all weighted just about equally. It is original price divided by technical score. So it's pretty anyway, but I think this is, again, this is the conversation. I think the concern from an industry standpoint is obviously the selection of a firm based on purely qualifications, right?
Well,
You know,
well,
that's
and
all
Nance, I
criticism
would-
and design build.
That was my
And-
point. You could get
And here it's solely based on that, and that just, you know, has a lot of concerns as to.
That's my point, Nance. If you could get the contractors involved in the selection process like North Carolina does with their design build, if you get the contractors involved in the selection process of the CMGC, then you'd have the transparency that would make people more at ease.